Dear students, welcome to the next session on database management system, and the topic of the session is weak entity sets. At the end of this session, you will develop an insight on weak entity sets in designing a database using ER diagrams. We can classify the entity types as being strong or weak. Now let us see what is meant by a strong entity set. An entity type that is not existent dependent on some other entity type is referred to as the strong entity type. That is, the existence of this particular strong entity is not dependent on any other entity in the database. An entity type is referred to be strong if its existence does not depend upon the existence of any other entity type in the database. A characteristic of strong entity type is that each entity occurrence is uniquely identifiable using the primary key attribute of that particular entity type. So, whenever an entity contains a primary key, then that particular entity is called as strong entity type. Example, the staff entity using the staff number attribute as the primary key is a strong entity type because it is having its own primary key and it is not dependent on any other entity for its existence. The next type is the weak entity type. An entity type that is existence dependent on some other entity type. For uniquely identifying a weak entity type, we have to dependent on any other entity type in the database. An entity set that does not have sufficient attributes to form a primary key is termed as a weak entity set. So we cannot form any primary key using the attributes of the weak entity type. A characteristic of a weak entity is that each entity occurrence cannot be uniquely identified using only the attributes associated with that entity type. With the help of the attributes of that particular entity, we cannot uniquely identify any occurrence of the entities. The weak entity types are sometimes referred to as the child, dependent or subordinate entities. The weak entities are also called as child or dependent or subordinate entities. And the strong entity types are called as parent or owner or dominant entities. For a weak entity set to be meaningful, it must be associated with another entity set which is called as the identifying or owner entity set. So every weak entity set has to be associated with another entity set which is a strong entity set, and that strong entity set is called as identifying or owner entity set. Every weak entity must be associated with this identifying entity, and that particular identifying entity set is said to own the weak entity set that it identifies. So this weak entity set is dependent on this identifying entity set, which in turn said to be owner of the weak entity set. The relationship associating the weak entity set with the identifying entity set is called as identifying relationship. When there is a connection through a relationship between the weak and the strong entity set, and then that relationship is said to be the identifying relationship. The discriminator of a weak entity set is a set of attributes that allows this distinction to be made. So you have a specialized one called as discriminator, that is a set of attributes that allows this differences to be given out. For example, the discriminator of the weak entity set section. You have a section in organization which consists of the attributes section ID, year and the semester. The discriminator of the weak entity set is also called as the partial key of the entity set. So this discriminator is called as partial key. It cannot form the total key, it is the partial key of the entity set. The primary key of a weak entity set is formed by primary key of the identifying entity set, that is the strong entity set which is associated with this weak entity set, together with the weak entity's discriminator. So we have the weak entity discriminator set of attributes that cannot form the total key, which is the partial key of that entity set. Together with that, we'll combine the primary key of the strong entity set. So this forms the primary key of the weak entity set. As a whole, the discriminator cannot form the primary key on its own, so it has to be combined with the primary key of the owner entity set. The primary key of section is now formed as course ID, section ID, year and semester. You could see that the section ID, year and semester are the discriminator set. So that is the set of attribute which helps to make this differentiation. So this belongs to the weak entity set, whereas the course ID is the primary key of the identifying entity set or the owner entity set, namely the course. So this course ID is from the course, which is a strong entity, and this section ID, year and semester are from the weak entity set, that is section. So this forms the discriminator, which is the set of attributes that allows to make this distinction. So we'll see how to represent this weak entity set in a ER diagram. In entity relationship diagram, a weak entity is depicted via a rectangle like a strong entity set, but there are two main differences in this. The discriminator of the weak entity set is underlined with a dashed line rather than a solid line. So we have already discussed that the discriminator in the section is section ID, semester and year. So here this discriminator of the weak entity set is underlined with dashed lines rather than solid line. So the solid line can be used to represent the primary key of strong entity set. Here in case of course, it is the owner entity set and this is the child entity set. So this is the parent and the child, and this is strong entity set and this is the weak entity set. As you could see that the strong entity set is having a primary key on its own, but the weak entity set do not have any primary key. It is having a partial key, also called as discriminator, which is a set of attributes, section ID, semester and year. And the second difference is that the relationship set connecting the weak entity set to the identifying strong entity set is depicted by double diamond. This means that here you have a weak entity set and this can be identified with the dashed lines here. So this section becomes the weak entity set. So this is how you can represent ER diagram with weak entity sets. Summary: we have discussed what is the difference between weak and strong entity set, how to find the difference, and how to identify or form the primary key of this particular relation having the discriminator from the weak entity set. And we have discussed how to represent this weak entity set in an ER diagram and how to establish the relationship between them. So this is the reference book and the textbook, Database System Concepts, 6th edition. Thank you for your patient listening.